How do I take a simple idea and make it more musical? So this works for anything, but in this case, I'm going to be using my counterpoint response that I've been teaching in my videos. Here I have a florid counterpoint response, and it simply is just a bass line for the given melody, highlighting D major, as you can see, very simple. And then the response written above it is just some counterpoint, but basically it's just a melody that is highlighting and playing with the D major melody on the bottom and creating just a nice melody over it. So it's very simple how it is now. Let's listen to it. Okay, so start playing a little bit of the other one. But as you can see, it's sounding more musical now already that we're doing the florid counterpoint. If you've been following this whole counterpoint thing, it's been evolving. Now the melody sounds more musical. Okay, so maybe you weren't doing counterpoint, maybe you just wrote a simple melody above a bass line, kind of like I did here. What can you do to now make this more musical? Well, here's what I started doing. I put a violin, and I also did cello. Well, it's gonna move it over. Here I am. Okay, and I took that same response, and I thought, well, let me just take everything, and let me take what I wrote in the bass line for the piano, and let me put that in the cello, and then let me take the top line and put in the violin, and I thought, well, let me listen to them separately, but what really happened was I listened to them together, just kind of parallel octaves like this, and I started getting a glimpse of a certain sound. So now let's listen to it. Okay, so I'm simply just going to take this one line here, and now I'm going to play around with it. Okay, so what I started doing was I realized maybe I don't need the cello, okay, because I already have a violin, I already have a piano, and doing a piano, violin, and cello, maybe not. Doing just violin and cello, I kind of want a piano in here. So I thought, well, I'll stick with the violin and piano, and I'll see what I can do with that. With this, I realized a few things. I also realized that, well, the violin could also do some of the bass notes. And then it also could do the top notes. Whatever it's doing, we could try to figure out what's going on here. So let's look at first. We have the beginning, which is D major. We have a fifth. We have the piano creating a fifth. So what happens if I just get that piano note? I move it down a third. So now the piano's creating a third with the bottom note, and my violin's creating a fifth. So now it just creates a simple triad chord. And that sounds more flavorful and more interesting than just playing the same exact note. Okay, further, let's see what else we can do. Well, I know that violins love playing sixths, and they can play sixth most of the time very easily. So now let's change this. We see a D. Let's put an F below it in the violin. So now we have a sixth there. And then, you know what? Let's just do, whoops. And why not do a few more sixths? Would be known as consecutive sixths. And then maybe I'll hold that last note there. Okay, now let's put that down there. So now that's moving in sixths to that. We can see that this still has this above that. And I still have the melody going on there. And maybe I'll keep the piano melody, and I'll just keep the basic idea from the violin. So instead of doing all this with the eighth notes in the violin, that might be a little much, not just for the player or anything, but just the sound of it. So why don't I just now turn that into a sixth, and then another sixth, but two different notes. Okay? Now let's see how this sounds. That didn't sound very good to me. Okay? And now I'm just going to get rid of that. So there's certain times where you'll do something, and you'll say, well, actually didn't sound very good. And we could also think about what chord we're hinting at the time. So we can see on the bottom that we have an F sharp, and then we can see above that the two probably harmony notes that we're going to have are the 6th and the 5th, being those are the two notes in there. So we have F sharp on the bottom, then we have a D, and we have a C. So what could I be hinting at? I could possibly be two different chords. I could be a D in the beginning with the D and the F, like a D6, the harmony centers at the top with the D. And then when it gets to the 5th, that could kind of switch into a new harmony to where it would be F. Okay? So maybe I could work with that now, with that thought process, and say, okay, well, what would work if I'm doing that D and I did an F below it? Oh, as you can see, I was in a different key. That's why it sounded so bad. So actually, what happened was I forgot that this is written in a key and it's now in C major. Okay, so this is supposed to be in D major, and I didn't think about that, so that's my bad. Now let's put it in D major. Okay, now we can see we're in D major now. So originally, this is what I had, and I don't know if it's going to sound good now, but it might sound good now. Let's see how it sounds. So that actually sounds harmonic. It didn't before, because what I had, there's a certain name for it, it's used in the Renaissance area, but what it is you have a, let's say an F sharp in one octave, and then an octave higher you have an F. So a semitone difference of notes used in a chord an octave apart creates a very bad sound. If they're in the same octave, you just have an F going to an F sharp or vice versa, that doesn't sound very bad. It's when they're an octave apart. So that's what I had there, and I heard it. Did not sound good. But now that I have this, now I kind of want the violin to start switching, and now I want the violin to kind of start doing the melody, and I'll just have the piano kind of doing that chord. So originally, because this is an embellishment of a 4-3 suspension, I'll just turn this to a half note, so now it's still a 4-3 suspension. Now the piano's not doing the melody. And I'll show you in a second here, probably more towards when I'm finishing this little section here, that then you start to play around with the dynamics. You start to say, okay, I want the piano louder here, I want it to maybe decrescendo, or diminuendo, whatever you want to call it, and I want the piano maybe to, or I want the violin, let's say, maybe doing a crescendo the whole time, so it's slowly getting louder, and then at this point when it's doing the melody, now it's louder. Just simple things like that. I'll show you that in a second. But first of all, we have the piano doing the chords and the violin doing the melody. Let's just see how that sounds. So I'll start from here now. Of course, because just highlighting that, it sounds perfectly fine. It sounds pretty good, actually. Okay, so now I want to actually probably keep the violin doing some of that melody. Why don't I do that? Why don't I just keep the violin doing that melody, and now I'll see what the piano can do with the chords. So let's look at, again, the harmony that we could be implying. I see an A and I see a C creating a third, and it looks like that's basically what's going on here. I have an A and a C. That's the harmonic notes that we're going to be working with. So why don't I do more than that? And with the piano, I could, let's say, just simply do a half note, could change it to an E, so now I'm a fifth above, and then here I could go to a C. So I'm just the third above when this goes down to the unison. So now let's just see how that sounds. Sounds good, but a little boring, so why don't I vary that and change this first to a dotted half note so it goes on a little longer than you expect, and then you hear this next note, which is a quarter note, which, looking at it, leads into this next quarter note, which now I think the melody will start going to the piano again. So let's hear how this sounds. So you heard that? This went a little longer, dun, and it goes dun, 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 dun. So that worked. So now at this point, I'll have these playing those notes. As you can see, I did the third above it. What's going on here? Oh, that goes down to the -1, of course. So that is what's going on. So still harmonizing with the 1. It goes down the -1, a slight voice crossing, which I went over in my floored counterpoint response videos. I go over all these responses in that video. Nose is a little itchy, sorry. But other than that, let's see. Now I want the piano to start playing the melody again. And I'll have the piano start to play the melody here, and here will be the goal that I'm thinking of. And then this last measure here, how about I play the melody in the piano and the violin, but I create chords to where maybe the piano is a third above the violin at all times, or something like that. Or maybe if it doesn't work, maybe they switch positions, which can be good, but I often like to do that with measures. Maybe a few measures of violin, a few measures of piano, not switching a bunch just in one measure, but I'm not there yet. Let's see. Okay, so the idea. Now I want the piano to play this. So now I want the violin to play the harmony below. Let's see what we're working with. We have an F and an A, and then we have an F and an A, and probably another harmonic note in here would be that D. So with a D and an F and an A, that would be a D chord in first inversion. So the notes D, F, and A, what could I do with that? Well, as we can see, I already have that F here, I have an A here. So why don't I switch it around, and what if I kind of did the opposite? And what if I did a D in my violin, and kind of copying what I just did before, kind of maybe creating a motivity a little bit, do a dotted half note, okay? And then instead of that, oh, I have an alarm going off, 1 second. Okay, we're all good. It's much later than I thought it was. Looks like this makes time go by very fast. Okay, so that was, I had the D, and now I'll put the C, or actually, oh yeah, actually, I have the dotted. So now, and it's not C. I was thinking too fast. So now I have the A, so now I have the D, F, and A, and that's all happening in the first. Now I have that whole chord built in the beginning, and then as it shifts to the end, where then I have the D in the piano, now I still, in the bottom of the piano, have the F being held down, D in the top of the piano, and then I have the A in the bottom of the violin. So you can see there we have some changing in the basically what was happening before. Basically it flipped around. So let's see how that sounds. Sounds good to me, but that leap in the violin sounds a little high to me. So what I was saying was I kind of want to do the same thing, but I want to do the violin and the piano basically making chords somehow. So with that idea of that sounding a little high, let me put this down a third, and let's see what happens here. Maybe I'll just put everything down a third. And that won't quite work, because now I'm going 3, 2, 1, and I'd be going down past the 1. So in that case, once I start going there, to that 1 there, why don't I now flip and go a third above where I was, and then go a third above where I was here. Okay, now let's just see how that sounds. Who knows if it'll sound good? That's a little quick for the violin in a passage like this. Let's see. So I honestly thought it sounded alright, but I think the violin sounded a little quick to me. So now with that whole idea, what can I do just to kind of have the same idea and the violin slower? Well, I can create that fifth, keep that fifth, and let's maybe with, I see I have the fifth going to a third, and I have an eighth note, then a quarter note. So that'd be the same value as a dotted quarter note. And then I can see that my third kind of holds out right there. So instead of doing that where I have 2 quarter notes and then an eighth note, well, I could just do a half note and then a eighth note rest. So now let's see how this sounds. Ooh, shifted it. Shifts it sometimes. Let's see how this sounds. Oops. You have to click on the actual note. So that didn't quite sound that good to me. And I think it's that it shifted down to the third. I didn't like that. And yeah, I think if I just actually change this into a dotted half note and get rid of this, now I have a quarter note rest, I think that'll sound much better to me. But I think that I still want that a little bit higher. So instead of going a third down, maybe I'll go here, maybe I'll even go a third above that to create a seventh of the chord. Let's see. That sounds good to me. So I like it just like that. I think it sounds good enough to me. And I actually kind of created my own composition, kind of like doing this, but have it much more developed. So I'm going to show you that at the end. And I'm going to show you the idea that I got from this and kind of what I did with it. Okay, so now let's play around with the dynamics. Let's have certain points be louder for certain areas and quieter for certain areas. Let's say louder where I want to hear the piano melody, softer where I don't want to hear the piano melody and I want to hear the violin. You know, you can kind of make sense of how I'm going to do that. But first, let's listen to it one more time so I could think about that as I'm listening to it. Okay, so first of all, I definitely think with that idea of the crescendo in the violin in the first two measures would be a good thing. So I'm going to go highlight those two notes, go into dynamics. I'm in Muse score. I'm going to add a crescendo from the first two measures to the second. So whenever I do something, I just listen to how it sounds like that. Let's hear how this sounds. Okay. But most of the time, I'm pretty sure mezzo forte is how everything starts, how it is. So let's listen to how it is now. Now let's do mezzo forte. I'm pretty sure it's the same thing. Maybe that was very slightly louder? Very slightly louder. So maybe it starts in mezzo piano. That sounds slightly quieter. So where it starts, what it seems like for Muse score, is right in the middle of mezzo piano, mezzo forte. So it's basically in the middle of that. Mezzo, mezzo, mezzo. I don't know what to call it, but it's in the very middle. Okay, so with that, I think I would just like to start in forte then, just to kind of get an idea with the piano. So I want the piano to come in louder from the beginning, and I want the violin to slowly get louder once it gets into its part of the melody, while at the same time, I think I want the piano to actually dip down a little quieter, starting at this note here, and maybe going to the next note. So basically, at beat 3 of the second measure, I'll have a little decrescendo starting on that suspended note. Let's hear how this sounds now. You know, it's not bad for me, but to be honest, I think that the violins are already a little bit too loud to begin with. So now let me take away that crescendo and listen to it. Yeah, I think it's a little too loud. So actually, I think the crescendo should just be from the suspended note, pretty similarly to the opposite of the piano, to where the melody starts in the violin. Now let's listen to this. It might be a little quick of a crescendo. It looks good to me. Let's see. I actually like how that sounds. And on top of that, I think it would sound good if I went loud on this note. So I'm trying to think, should I do a fortissimo? Probably not. Let's see how it sounds. I think fortissimo might actually work perfectly there. So let's do fortissimo, in other words, double F, because forte is the one F. So that's exactly what I want. And on top of that, now that's where the piano melody starts picking up again. The violin melody is already kind of going down. So why don't I create another diminuendo, decrescendo? I guess, yeah, they call it diminuendo here, from these eighth notes into this dotted half note. And actually, that gets a little quiet. So at this note, then there, I know mezzo forte is not a dynamic a lot of people are going to recommend using, but you got to remember that they're talking about an orchestra. When you're doing chamber music like this, mezzo piano and mezzo forte are heard much differently than in a big ensemble. When you're doing a string quartet or something, and you have mezzo forte and mezzo piano, you can actually hear that. But when you have an orchestra doing mezzo forte, mezzo piano, there's not much of a difference between those in a big ensemble, and it will create a moment that isn't very loud and isn't very quiet. And as you know, a lot of times in a symphony or symphonic piece, you're going to want quiet moments and loud moments. So a lot of people, teachers and orchestrators, will recommend not using mezzo dynamics a lot. And I would say I wouldn't disagree. It's just that in a chamber ensemble, in a chamber environment, you can hear the difference more. And actually, let's say I put this as piano or a forte in the violin, neither of those would be the effect that I want. That'd be too quiet or too loud. I want it to be a little bit loud, so I'm doing mezzo forte. Okay, so let's listen to that now. Good. I like that. What else could I do? I want to maybe do a Forsanzo? I don't know how to pronounce that really. I know what it is. Let's do one of those and see how that sounds. I like the effect, but I don't think that's at the correct moment. And I think the mezzo forte worked much better there. So now let's listen to the whole thing and just see how it sounds. And normally if it sounds good enough, I'll move on, because spending way too much time in one area, it might even end up sounding worse, different, and you might just end up spending too much time, and the end result might not be that much different. If it has the basic effect you're going for, I recommend moving on. You can always go back to it. So let's see if it sounds good enough. So I actually like that. I have no problem with that. And the only thing is that you see the bass of the piano, the left hand of the piano is just playing whole notes. Pretty boring. We can all admit that. So I think at this point I would move on, and I'd possibly make some other parts of the song, and I wouldn't focus on this too much. And let's say once I make a section, then I could go back and I could start to change these left hand notes of the piano to maybe be a melody underneath that's playing on the basic idea, or some bottom notes, maybe octaves, probably not, but maybe powerful moment, you do octaves in the left hand and of the tonic note that you're implying at the time, or the bass of the harmony. Some things like that, or I could even just stick with that and do some more complex chords up top in the right hand with the piano. But basically the whole point is this is the basic idea. Okay, so now what else? So now that we have this basic idea, what can we do from here basically? Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you what I did. So in my florid counterpoint response, I kind of explained that I listened to the end of this melody going into the next melody, and I thought, I really like how that sounds. And it's kind of, it's not a key change, but it changes keys. It goes from D major to F major. So it's not like a modulation that uses a pivot chord or anything, but it harshly goes from D major to F major. And that sound is interesting for a few reasons. One of which is because of how this ends. It ends on basically a chord of chord 1, but it's highlighted in the last beat using eighth note, quarter note, and then a half note. So what's going on is in the final notes leading up to the last cadence, the last note, the resolution is very slight and minimal, and it's not established in a way that you'd expect to hear at the end of a piece or something. It's very slight, and you don't really notice that it created the cadence. And because of that, it creates a cadence harmonically in your ears that you don't notice all that much, and when it gets into the next F major, it clashes. And then you start to hear this, and it's clashing in the first few notes or first few measures, and then at some point it starts to sound harmonious. And it's because this is all in harmony. It's all harmonious, and you hear that it's in harmony with itself, and your ears adapt to that new key. It's a very interesting effect, and I played with that. So let's listen to what it sounds like on piano first. And it may be a little weird to look at this, but we're just going to listen. And it's still in fortissimo from before. So you really hear those piano notes being hammered down loudly. Sounds pretty good. But basically that was very interesting to me how those keys clashed. And then from there, of course, I did the same thing to where I got the upper part of the violins and I put that up above, and then I did that into the next thing, and we already listened to the whole thing, so I'm not going to play the whole thing over, but I'm just going to play the transition. And now let's hear how it sounds with the violins. And it does start from this high point. So basically where it starts from is this upper note here. Let me actually make sure. Oh, I did zoom in one. I thought I was zoomed out. Sorry, I won't keep it like that. I'll double check. Okay. So now let's listen to it. So you can hear the violin adds a whole new depth to it. It adds more interest. It kind of just sounds nicer with the strings added. So we can see these simple ideas added to violin, added to more instruments, already sound better by themselves. When you start to add some more variation of what's going on, and you start to have one instrument do one thing and other instrument do the other thing, and they start maybe switching off, the dynamics start to change, and you hear the piano doing the melody, and then it gets quieter, you hear the violin doing the melody, and then the violin starts doing the chords and supporting everything, and these things will start to just make it musical. And you can see where it's actually pretty simple, and a lot of it is listening to how it's going to sound. Of course, a lot of composers were taught that they just sat down and they had everything in their head and they just wrote it down on a piece of paper, which is a reality, but the reality is also a lot of them were sitting behind a piano for many hours, playing what they were writing and see if it sounded good. And don't burden yourself. In today's day and age, we have the ability to literally write down what we're thinking and listen to it. So back in the day, there's many stories of composers writing certain things, seeing it performed in person, and being embarrassed or something and thinking, oh my gosh, what did I write that did not sound how I thought it was going to sound? So we're taught people like Mozart imagined everything in their head and could hear everything in their head, which is probably very true. But it could also be the fact that everyone's human, and sometimes you imagine something to be a certain way and it's not. For example, if you hear a certain note in a clarinet and you think, oh, I'll put that note with something with a trumpet or something, and you think it'll sound good, and you score both of them really high, and then the trumpet's overtones actually end up being heard so loudly that it ruins everything. And just something like that, you could experience that by scoring it on MuseScore and then listening to it. Okay, so from here, let's see what I kind of did from here. And I'm not really going to show you exactly what this is because this is part of my score. But let's see how I kind of took that basic idea and I turned that into a beginning of a violin and piano sonata. Okay, so let's listen to this. Okay, so I don't want to show you everything, but there's the idea. And then, as you see, it's been doing a lot of violin, piano, switching off, and then basically what happened was the whole theme went through, and then you kind of heard it again with the violin doing octaves. So then I restated the violin doing octaves, so you start hearing that noise, and then that transitioned to the theme starting again, and then with chords. So now that your ear got used to the violin playing some octaves, then I started playing around the same idea, but bunch of chords of the violin. So you kind of adapted the ear originally with a single line of the violin playing the melody, octaves, and then chords. And then from there, that leads into a moment to where the theme is restated as a piano variation. Okay, so you can see that, I don't know for you, but for me it was a very clear ending. And how I did that was I basically led up to a moment where everything went up very high, and then it goes way back down low, and then it stood still, and that's kind of what happened. But the main thing that made you feel that it was the ending was that then I got the piano and the violin, and I stretched them a good amount, not too far, but at a lower and higher notes of their registers. So you heard the lower sounds and the higher sounds, and they're very loud as well. They both crescendoed to the end, and then it was also a very full chord of the tonic chord. So all these things put together makes you feel like, okay, yeah, that was the ending, and it was very clear. Okay. So now, what else could I do from there? That's kind of the whole idea, is I basically just took everything and I started putting it into violin and piano in my case. And that's what I did. I also started writing another score, and that started as a simple bass, like a bass line, and then I wrote above that soprano line for the piano. And then I transposed that, or translated that, into the key that I wanted it to be, and then I put that in violin and piano too, and yeah, and starting to create a sonata out of it. I also have a transitionary period. I'll show you this, to where I heard some chords on a Schumann string quartet number 3. The very ending chords, actually. I thought I really liked that. So I basically took the idea and I wrote down basically I wrote down the notes in the key that he was using. I transposed it to the key I was using, and then I put on violin and piano and thought, how can I make this work? And then from there, I got the basic idea and created something different about it. His was the ending of the piece, and mine creates a dramatic effect where I modulate. So let's listen to this now. So now I have some modulations. Okay, so you get it. There's some stuff going on here. And just to kind of give you ideas of what's going on, I'm creating different moments and stuff. And I've studied the sonata, and with that, it gave me a lot of perspective on writing this piece. To where I had a first theme, and I created a second theme, and that right there was part of the transition from the first theme to the second theme. So basically, with all that, you can see to where studying music, studying harmony, chords, counterpoint, all this stuff, and then the violin, piano, music theory, all that stuff is very helpful. It helped me write this piece, this music, make sense of it, and I actually only did all this in a few days. I'm trying to be oppressive or anything, but I've just been working consistently, and I haven't had to sit here and think about things, or what do they call it? I forget what they call it, when you can't think of a music idea. I don't get that, because I've been learning a lot of stuff, and I attribute a lot towards my hard work. I've been learning a lot of stuff, studying a lot of stuff, and now if I think about if I want to make music or do something, I have a lot of ideas in my head simply from what I've been taught, from the teachers and the books that I've read, YouTube videos I've watched, and everything else. So I want to thank everyone who's helped me learn all this stuff. For one, I don't think anyone would be watching this video, but thank you for everyone that's taught me the music stuff. I'm trying to also add to the music teaching platform online, teach some stuff. Hopefully that's not really taught in other YouTube videos. So until next time, goodbye.